Okay, so thanks so much to everybody who is here. Like I said, I expect a few more folks, and there were some people who weren't able to make it, and so we'll be making this recording available. I'm delighted to have you join us for this conversation. For those folks involved in Life and Legacy, I think that this is going to dovetail very nicely with the training we have coming up on February 10th, which will also be speaking about integrating our the work that we do in fundraising, our annual fundraising, with the very important work of planned giving and legacy giving. So I am not going to say much on this topic because we have Dirk Bird on hand. He is the Vice President of Planned Giving and Endowment and the Managing Director of Total FRD, which is Fundraising Development for Jewish Federations of North America. So as a former Chief Development Officer of Jewish Colorado and the former Executive Director of the Jewish Community Foundation in Denver, Dirk has extensive experience in development planning, lay leadership engagement, major gift development, family philanthropy, gift planning, next generation engagement, professional development, mentoring and supervision, and overall donor stewardship. Dirk is a proud Colorado native who currently resides in Denver with his wife, Karen, and their 3 beautiful children. A side note, and we won't hold it against him, is that he did get his start at the Federation in Columbus, Ohio, where he worked, I believe was hired by a very dear friend of mine who was then director. So really great connections, and we're glad to have you here, Dirk. And I will let you take it away.
Just to get it on the record, my rooting interest this past fall was squarely with y'all. So I don't hold any affinity for the Ohio State University. So I just wanted to put that out there to make it very clear. Thank you for the opportunity, Eileen. I look forward to working with you. I put my contact information in chat. That way, if there are things that we explore tonight, if you have questions, if I could be a resource to you as you continue to do this work, it would be my pleasure to do so. I have some good news. This is not going to be a frontal presentation. This is going to be an audience participation conversation. I'm finding that we're seeing diminishing returns on Zoom. Our machines are rebelling and our brains are rebelling against the same machines. So I'm not going to be sharing a PowerPoint, but rather hopefully guiding a conversation around how do we build and sustain this culture of legacy giving that we're starting to see really take hold in the community, and what are some of the next steps that we can explore together as leaders in the community doing this work. I want to pause before we get into some of the topics, just off the top, to address any burning questions that you had coming into this, just to make sure that if you've got questions that we capture those up front, some of which we may get into during the course of the conversation, and some of which we may get into at the very end. So I just wanted to throw it open. Anything that's on your mind that you want to make sure that we discuss here tonight? I won't sing the Jeopardy theme. We're all good? Okay. If you think of something, or if you have a question, please throw it in chat. Raise your hand, and I'll prompt some questions a little bit later on, but don't hesitate to throw something in chat so you don't forget it. I'll make sure that we come back to that. The other thing that I want to throw out there too, and Eileen and I have talked about this a little bit, it would be my pleasure to do ongoing work with you as a community, as you get deeper into life and legacy, as you talk about other legacy giving opportunities, endowment development. We do a lot of work with Arlene and her team, and hopefully complement some of the great training that you'll get from Life and Legacy as well. So whatever you need on that front. So first, I think it's helpful when we have this conversation, just to talk a little bit about sort of the macro environment of what we're seeing, both in terms of legacy giving in particular, but the macro environment of philanthropy. And my guess is that you've seen some changes in philanthropy over the course of time. And I'd be curious, in terms of your donor base, and let's talk about it from an annual campaign standpoint. Are you seeing growth in your annual campaign? And is that growth coming from the same set of donors, or are you seeing growth from new participants? What's sort of the baseline that you're seeing in the community? Ellen, you just came off mute. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'm on the board at Jewish Family Services. And interestingly, we just got a report today at our development meeting that our fundraising results went up significantly in 2021 against 2020. Couple of reasons for that. One, the community knew what we were doing in response to the pandemic, particularly homebound people, bringing food to them. And also because of our increased involvement in refuge, we are the agency in this county that's authorized to do refugee resettlement. And of course, we've been doing a tremendous amount of that, 300 people coming to us from Afghanistan. So we have a lot of new donors. Interestingly, many of them are not Jewish, but we have many new donors. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I greatly appreciate that. And that may represent some unique opportunities for you as an organization with that subset of donors to engage in deeper conversations around legacy. Anybody else want to share, maybe from the Federation perspective, of what you're seeing in your annual campaign? Where's the bulk of your campaign coming from? Maybe give us a little bit of color there. Eileen.
Yeah, so we have been holding fairly steady, and Babette will correct me on numbers because I'm terrible at remembering numbers, but something about 60% of our campaign comes from major donors, which are 5,000 and above. We have seen an increase in our major donor pool over the course of the last, 3 or 4 years, which has been really nice. And we've also seen some very nice increases in our campaign. Like other federations around the country, we have had some decrease in number of donors, although it's not significantly. We were actually on an increase in the number of donors and then we dropped 1 year by about 200 donors, and then just in 2020, and then last year we couped many, a large number. We're almost up to the 2019 level. And we've been seeing a lot of success at lapsed and new donors. So we actually, in some sense, we noticed that Ann Arbor had bucked the trend, which is seeing growing campaigns and shrinking donor bases. We've been somewhat successful at maintaining our donor base or the numbers.
And
but
of those
campaign has not grown significantly either.
Yeah, and of those major donors, are those demographically donors that are boomers and older? Is it more of a mix? What's the demographic?
I mean, I would say the majority are definitely boomers and older.
Yeah.
And we have also seen a number of, let's say, borderline boomers, like just so between, let's say, 50 and 60. So which is very borderline. I'm at the tail end of that, of the boomer. So we are seeing some new donors coming in, or new major donors in that next bracket.
And I don't like to, I mean, sometimes it helps to paint a broad brush, but I wanted to get some specific information about the community in Ann Arbor, because you may have opportunities that are slightly different or slightly unique to you. In general, what we're seeing across most of our communities, and it's not just federations, it's all of our Jewish communal institutions, is that we may be raising more money. And I think certainly 2021 was a year we saw pretty robust philanthropy across the board, especially in the area of plan giving and endowment, which tells us that it tells us a couple of things. It tells us that for a lot of our donors, their resource base is increased over where it was a couple of years ago, and psychologically, and I talk about this with a lot of our communities. Psychologically, because of the pandemic, our donors may be, there's a baseline level of vulnerability. And I don't mean that from a risk standpoint. I mean that from the standpoint of, I am more in contact and aware of my values, aware of the change that I want to make with my philanthropy. And the third piece, which is really important, I want to discuss it. I want to have that conversation with those who advise me on my philanthropy, whether that's a professional advisor, an estate planning attorney, an accountant, a CPA, a wealth advisor, or a philanthropic advisor. And we're hearing this from professionals, professional advisors, and lay leaders across the board that now represents a really opportune time to engage our donors in the kinds of conversations around gifts of permanence that you're starting to do. The other factor for a lot of our communities, and I'm sure it's true in Ann Arbor as well, is that for many of those donors who are our major donors, they're our loyalist donors, and they've been our major donors for decades, and they've made deep, deep investments in the community. And we have a window of time, a limited window of time during which to engage them in these kinds of conversations. We're not alone in that market, especially in a place like Ann Arbor. My guess is the University of Michigan Development Department is probably pretty robust. And my guess is they're pretty good at the plan giving stuff. And that for a lot of your donors, they're active elsewhere in philanthropy. And many of those organizations are engaging the donors who may be most loyal to your organizations in conversations around gifts of permanence. And the piece I think that sort of stands out is when our donors are being engaged by others around their legacy, around reinforcing the investment that they've made in a particular organization over the course of time, and they're not being engaged by us. What does that communicate? It's not a rhetorical question. I'm really curious. What do you think that communicates?
It communicates that we do not have the need for their support.
Okay, it could be the need. We don't really need their support in that way. What else?
Or care about them.
We don't care about maybe them in the same way. Babette, can you expand on that? Because I think that's really interesting.
Well, I think that if somebody reaches out, I mean, there's, this old story of, it's apocryphal perhaps, but, somebody had $1 million and, why did they give it to that university? And when they had a longstanding relationship with another organization, because that university or whatever organization it was asked and convinced them and spend time with them. So
yeah, that's a great point. And usually I get this a little bit later on, but since Babette raised the issue, what is the number one factor that leads someone to leave a legacy gift? What's the number? Someone asks, yes, that intervention of someone, whether it's professional or a lay leader, asking someone to create a gift of permanence, asking someone to leave a legacy to the community creates a sea change. That intervention plants the seed and opens the door of what might be possible. And by having that conversation, by asking our donors to consider these kinds of gifts, what are we communicating to them? And this is really fundamental because it goes to the nature of how we do our work. What are we communicating to our donors when we ask them to consider leaving legacies?
They're important.
That they
Are important.
Not the philanthropy. I think it's an important distinction, Ronnie, so I appreciate your mentioning it, that they are important, that they have unique value, and that their contributions over the course of time have not been made in vain. Ronnie, keep going.
And that they're needed.
And that they're needed. Excellent. What else does it communicate?
That we're forward thinking, that we're thinking about the future of the community.
That's outstanding. I think oftentimes when we plan for legacy giving, endowment campaigns, and I sometimes use those interchangeably. I don't want to confuse anybody by doing that, because we're soliciting on bequests that may not become endowments, and we're also soliciting endowments. We don't often think about what it represents for an organization to engage their donors in this. And I do a lot of work with communities, and we talk about 3 different case elements. And I've sent some of this information to Eileen, and Eileen, you could feel free to share my notes and I'll send some additional resources. But there are 3 case elements that we talk about in building a case for a culture of legacy giving. The first of which is the business case. And one of the elements of the business case is what we've been talking about, which is what are we doing now proactively to ensure that we have the necessary resources to sustain our programs and operations for the next generation? Will we have diverse streams of revenue so that we can remain entrepreneurial, flexible, nimble, thoughtful, creative, whatever term you want to use? Will we have that resource base in place? The other is are we thinking about, and are our actions backing this up, about building that future? And one of the acts of asking the question of our donors is, will you consider a legacy gift? Is it gives an indication that the organization isn't just thinking about today. And I know for all of us, we get caught up in this trap of measuring our success on 12-month increments. And I think that's more prevalent in federations, since the annual campaign is so paramount in many of our communities. Might not be to the same extent for some of our other organizations where you've got other programs and services maybe more prominent. But when we measure ourselves in 12-month increments, and that's the window through which we view the world, it gets difficult to think beyond that. So it does demonstrate to our donors that we are thinking beyond just the next 12 months. We are invested in building the future of our Jewish community. The second piece there is and I'll share this as a follow-up. There's the moral case. What's our obligation? What's our obligation as Jewish leaders to, let me take a step back. All of us have one thing in common. Every single person on this Zoom screen is the beneficiary of someone's legacy. Every single one of us, whether that was a family member, whether that was a member of a community who ensured an experience that we had, whatever form it took, all of us are the beneficiaries of someone else's legacy. So from a moral standpoint, as leaders and as organizations, what's our obligation to ensure that future generations are given the same gift? There was a great article that was written at the very beginning of the pandemic. I think it was April and May of 2020. It was written by Dr. Bruce Powell, who's a longtime day school leader from Los Angeles. And it was an e-Jewish philanthropy, and the title of the article was Endowment Development, a Moral Imperative. And I'll share that with Eileen, because I think that that's a good grounding premise and value for the organizations to see this as a moral obligation. And then the third case element is the relational element. And this goes back to how we do our work. And the relational case talks about how we see our donors. What's the lens through which we're viewing them as unique humans on the planet, people who have individual impacts on our work, who can leave a legacy that will create ripples well into the future? What does taking a relational approach actually mean, and what are the results? So we talked about what's the most powerful act we can take in this? It's asking someone to leave a legacy gift. Well, once we do that, what does it then trigger? When someone leaves a legacy gift, what typically happens in terms of their connection to that organization? What happens for that donor? I will sing. I will sing. You don't want me to sing. No singing? Any guesses? What do you think happens? Ellen, go, please.
Yeah, I mean, it might deepen or it might not deepen. I think it depends on how the organization, on what steps the organization takes.
Okay, so that's really
if good stewardship is not provided, the gift could get shaky.
Yes.
And I want to add one other thing to what you're talking about.
Please. Thanks,
I believe in this community, as in many, we have some major donors who are aging out. They've passed away, and some of our really big donors, and that's going to have an impact on the community, not only here, but also in the synagogues and the other organizations in our community.
And I think that that's an important point around the urgency piece. I mean, it goes back to something we talked a little bit earlier, which is how are we viewing our work? And if all that we're looking at is what we're raising from an annual standpoint, whether we're a federation or a JCC or a JFS or a synagogue, and we just start over every 12 months, then we lose track of that conversation. And if the lens through which we view our donor engagement doesn't include this longer term relational approach to a legacy conversation, then we're really just facilitating transactions, because we're not communicating to the donor about the importance of creating something for the future.
So I wanted
Go
to
ahead.
add.
Yeah, go
answer
ahead,
your
Eileen, please go.
question, what you said. I think in some sense, it creates a deeper connection. I mean, I think, yes, I'm not I think stewardship is very important, and to maintain that connection is really key. But when somebody says, I am going to make a legacy gift, they're literally investing in the community. I mean, the investment takes place longer, but they're basically making a long-term investment in that organization. And so, when people give on an annual basis, well, maybe they'll give 1 year, maybe they won't give the other year, maybe there's some reason they don't want to. It's more, it flows differently, and there's not that same obligation. Whereas when one has made this commitment, it feels to me like there's, that there would be more of this long-term commitment to the organization.
Yeah, so typically what we see, even from the moment where the question is first posed, it creates a different connection point for the donor. Because the organization is approaching them in a particular way. Saying, you've given to this organization over the course of time, you've made a deep investment in our work. We would love to engage you in a conversation about protecting that work going forward. So from that act going forward, we typically see that donors are more deeply connected to the organizations that they leave legacy gifts to, and their giving during their lifetime to those organizations increases, because they have this deeper sense of connection, because they're more closely connected to the work and they've got something else to protect. It does put the responsibility on all of organizations to steward our donors accordingly, to make sure that we are maintaining that relationship and deepening that relationship. Now, we're pretty good at doing that in the context of an annual fundraising effort, where we've got donor levels and we recognize people. What are the ways, what are you doing now to lift up and elevate and raise the profile of this type of giving across the community? What are you doing to steward donors who've created endowments, who've left legacy gifts? What's taking place right now? Yeah, Susan.
I think some of what we're doing in relation to life and legacy is very, very important. There's a lot of ongoing feedback, not only on a community basis, but also from the various organizations. And I think that you almost can start to get like a herd mentality. People are doing it, your friends are doing it. So I think there's a real positive vibe on that. It's I wouldn't say it's shaming, but I've heard people say, how could you not do that? And things like that. So I think that really is very, very important.
You're normalizing the practice of leaving a legacy gift. You're embedding it into the culture of the community. What else? What else are you seeing in terms of lifting up this type of giving? Let me ask a question. Are in your organizations, are you taking opportunities through your marketing channels, through your events, when we used to have events, to profile donors who've taken this step, to recognize those who have not only created new gifts, but to recognize those who came before us, the generations before us? How are they impacting your work today? Are there opportunities that you're taking to recognize those kinds of contributions? Is anybody doing that in the course of their normal work?
Yeah, I think Federation.
Eileen and then Babette.
Okay.
Go ahead, Babette.
No, I was just going to say we definitely done it at Federation. We profiled Joelle. She's on the call here, and another younger donor. And I'm trying to think. There may have been an older donor too. I think is the challenge is pulling that out, and making it clear that this is a legacy gift here in our community, because we're small and our communications often, we try to put them all together in federation so that we're not overburdening people with lots of communication. So I think it gets a little confused. I mean, I've heard some people say, oh yeah, I did hear about that, but it was 2 years ago, and yeah, I've got to do it. And, it's sort of, I think we have the challenge of how do we pull that out and make it special without being information overload. So I don't know if Eileen if she would agree with me, but I think we need that avenue and how we can best do that. We have had big ads, and we've had community ads that all 11 organizations are highlighted. So, but it's still how do we do that the best way possible?
Yeah, but these
Alan,
aren't the
please.
first endowments that we've had in the community. And I know the synagogue and the temple, both when they fund a lectureship or a Shabbat that was funded by an endowment, we're making sure that the attendees and the membership recognize that this event was by the endowment of XYZ family, who made this endowment 20 years ago, and it's an ongoing. We have to start doing that at the federation level. We're only into this in a few years in any organized fashion, but the federation will have to also provide resources out of their endowments to fund things within the community, and we'll need to recognize that those have been funded by these various endowments. So it encourages other people to give, and it recognizes gifts that have already been made, that it's making a difference in the community.
100%. Alan is spot on. As how do we elevate what we're already doing and make the connection for our community that these programs, services, events, whatever it happens to be, were made possible by those who created endowments to support Jewish life. Something as simple as even for our boards, whether it's the Federation Board or one of the other organizations, is does your board know the economic impact of endowments on your operations from an annual basis? How much money is coming into the Federation, for example, from those who created endowments? What does that
So
look like?
I will just share that.
I know you know.
No, the truth is that compared to most of the other organizations that have endowments, we actually have very little from our
Okay.
Budget right now is from endowment. The other organizations, with the founding of the foundation, and with the support of the foundation in the early years, really worked very hard to develop these specific endowments for particular purposes, to a much greater extent than Federation. And Federation, that's an area in which we need to improve. So I think other organizations might be in a better position to let you know that information, actually.
No, I think it's really from a board leadership standpoint, part of our board education, because we do a fairly good job of talking about what we raise in the annual campaign, whether it's 2.5 or 17.9 or whatever the number happens to be. We repeat it over and over again. Are we doing the same socialization with every single year? Our organization has $400,000 that comes to us from these endowed gifts. Are we announcing that as a lead gift for our annual fundraising efforts? Are we putting it, is that the lead talking point at our events or at our annual meeting? Whatever that happens to be for you that reaches your largest audience, those are the types of talking points that are really critical. The parallel to that, and this may be more important for the Federation, just given what Eileen said, but I would say that it's critical for most of our organizations, is how many of your organizations have conducted any form of a gap or a risk analysis? Do you want clarification on what the hell I'm talking about?
I think Steve said that his organization has.
Steve, please.
You're muted. Okay.
We're actually in the process of doing that to take the money, especially the PPP money and our excess cash, to figure out what to do with it, to look at where we have holes in our annual budget. So when I'm saying we, I'm sorry, I forgot to put which of my many hats. I'm the treasurer of the Conservative Synagogue in town, Beth Israel. So.
Okay. So you're looking at a risk from what standpoint then, Steve? What's your goal with the risk assessment?
Basically to know how much of our annual budget is covered by, operating funds versus what we can pull out of the endowments. And our endowments are tiny considered percentage wise of what we need to raise. So that's really what the issue is. And that is technically at risk every year because it's not guaranteed like endowment fund is guaranteed. So that's what, I mean, at the highest level, that's what I'm talking about. But
yes, and that's excellent. I would submit that at an individual donor level, this is really critical to do as well. Whether you're looking at synagogue members, you're looking at annual supporters, is when we've had that conversation earlier about the major donors. And I think Eileen said 60% of the annual campaign of the Federation comes from those who give 5,000 and up. Whatever the data happens to be, it tends to skew. It's a very small percentage of your donor base that's giving the most significant resources. And I'm not saying only focus on those major donors, because we know that life and legacy giving, there are other indicators, frequency of giving over the course of time, board involvement. It's not necessarily a giving level thing. However, we have limited capacity and we have a limited window with some of our donors. So do we as organizations know of those donors who give, let's say 5,000 and up? And maybe we'll cross-reference with those donors who are 65 and up. And maybe we'll add another factor to this, those who are served in leadership capacity, either in a board or committee. Of those, how many of those individuals have communicated to us that they intend to endow their gift or leave some form of a legacy? And what we counsel most communities to do is to go through that similar exercise. And then usually it's just a couple of factors. It's a giving level and above, and then it's an age and above. That'll give you an indication of that subset of donors, what might be at risk. Because more often than not, there's a large percentage of dollars that may be at risk because those same donors haven't been asked to consider legacy gift or haven't communicated it to you. Now, some of them have done it, but we may not know it. That risk analysis or gap analysis for a lot of organizations, especially at a leadership level, at a board level, oftentimes is the thing that creates the most urgency around the prioritization of these conversations. Because we've seen in other communities where life and legacy during the formal 4 or 5 years that it's in a community, there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of momentum. There's accountability. Dina or Tammy or Arlene, whoever your community contact is following up, making sure you're submitting your reports, making sure you're doing your work, and then that goes away once the formal program goes away. So how do we keep that urgency and sustain this as a priority? And part of that is really understanding what we're looking at organizationally over the course of time. What is at risk? Because none of us are going to live forever. Hopefully our donors will live for a very, very, very long time, but we can't take for granted that that's something that we can do tomorrow. And that has been historically one of the challenges that we've seen in our communities, is that the annual fund or the membership drive or something else gets in the way of having these conversations. I'm going to pause there because I think there were some comments. Susan, did you want to add something to this?
I would say, I've been either the treasurer or on finance committee for a variety of organizations. The amount of money that right now is coming in from endowments for the majority, I think the synagogues and the temple, the congregations are in better shape. But in the other organizations, there's not a huge amount of money that is coming from endowments. I mean, I'm currently the treasurer of JFS, and I know what we get. And I have that's why I was so thrilled that this Life and Legacy program is off to the start it is, because
Yes.
as you said, that is the lifeblood of what we need to do. Through the years, there have been people who will understand the importance of endowing their annual pledge. And I think, Federation has been, quite good about doing that. but it's not a huge number. And as Alan, I know, said earlier, the thing is, once we're done with the formal phases of life and legacy, we absolutely need to be very, very determined about keeping stewardship going, and also constantly having a conversation with people. One of the problems I think we also have is that in many ways, Ann Arbor has a very somewhat transitory population. And over the years, I've always said nobody should be allowed to move out of this town without an exit interview. You know, the people move out, they've had their kids bar mitzvahed and bat mitzvahed and married here, and they go out, they leave, and they take their annual gifts with them. So I think those are the kinds of things that are so critical for us to do, because too many of us are relying on, you know, very generous gifts on an annual basis. But as Alan,
Did we lose Susan? I think maybe I lost Susan. I think what Susan was about to say is a really critical point, is that, you know, what are we doing to really get to
also said we're coming from.
We lost you for a second, Susan. Sorry. I think you're back now. Okay. Other comments to this point, around really understanding our donor base and the risk or the opportunity in front of us to build that urgency. Any other comments there? Babette, please.
I just have a comment that, you know, I've tried with my donors to move that along, but once you get past the annual community campaign discussion, it is difficult to sit them down at that same time. So, you know, and as people are saying, we don't have endowments. So I'm still thinking, how do you, you know, and we're still in the midst of life and legacy. So let's just stick with that. You know, how do we, you know, really pull in more people into that life and legacy piece, and make it very, very clear. I still think there's a little bit of haziness out in the community, even though we've done our quotas. You know, what is the best tactic to get, you know, people to sit down? And I'd be interested to hear from the other organizations whether, you know, how they feel, you know, they can set the stage during that annual community campaign piece for the life and legacy or the endowment piece.
I have some thoughts, but I agree with Babette. I'd love to hear from others about what you're seeing that's working in terms of launching those conversations. Who here is part of the life and legacy leadership team for the organization? Say, if you, what's working for you? How are you starting these conversations with the people you're reaching out to?
In response to Babette's question or issue, most of the synagogues and temples, it's a paper transaction about dues. It isn't an individual conversation. Federation, I think, does much more of that individual conversation. But folks, maybe the temples need to start having individual conversations about their dues. And it's a relatively easy conversation, I believe, in talking to somebody about their dues, and then say, have you done life and legacy? You know, you're committed at this wonderful level here. Have you thought about the future? And you can roll from that. But I think the synagogues maybe have to start looking at that model, because for a lot of the members, you know, they're 3-day-a-year Jews, and we don't really reach out and have a good conversation with them about the organization, what we're doing, what our needs are. You know, what do we get? 10% at our annual meetings, if we're lucky. So we need to increase the interaction and conversation with our membership, especially in the synagogues.
Alan, I think, makes a great point. And a lot of, when we talk about the relational case for this from a donor engagement standpoint, we often talk about how we do our work. And typically how you do your work sends also communication to a donor. And I know this is nobody here, but we do hear stories, myths, tales of federations where a conversation is something like this. Yeah, hi. Yeah, annual campaign. Yeah, it's me. Hey, annual campaign. Same as last year? Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much. Bye. And that represents fundraising in a lot of organizations, not just Federation. So how are we creating the space to engage in the kind of conversations with our donors that lead to these conversations? And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the context of having an annual campaign conversation. In fact, I would start at a more basic level. What do we know about our donors? Forget about the outcome of the conversation or where we're trying to take it, whether it's an annual conversation, a capital gift, capacity building, legacy. What do we know about our donors? Who are they as Jews on the planet? What do they care about most? What do they think of when they think of who influenced them to get involved in community? What do they think of when they think about the legacy that they're leaving? What are their hopes for the future of the community? I mean, there's a litany of questions that I can share, but are we taking the time to make that part of our normative practice, just from a basic donor engagement standpoint, even in the context of outreach for annual fund drives or annual campaign? Because these conversations, these legacy conversations, cannot take place in transactional ways if we want something more than transactional results. And I think that's a piece that's a bit of a fine line, especially with getting life and legacy off the ground, because there are goals, there are quarterly goals, and there are matching funds. And we do know that some of our donors who sign declarations of intent, they're giving but a small amount of money just so that we can count that as part of our goals. But that's not where the conversation stops. That's a jumping off point for deepening that conversation beyond just the context of life and legacy and back to what they care about and the change that they want to see happen. But how we do our work as professionals or volunteers who've taken on this opportunity, and thank you for doing so, reaching out to our donors to ask them to meet face to face is going to communicate something very strong to that person who's on the other end of the email or the phone. And I'm COVID notwithstanding, because I know it's difficult right now and Zoom is not optimal, but based on what we're hearing from donors who want to have this conversation and based on the amount of money, I have the opportunity to speak with plan giving and endowment directors from across the Jewish Federation system. And I look forward to seeing the total results of what was taken in 2020-21. But the amount of money that's coming into already existing plan giving vehicles is astounding. Our donors have resources they want to give. Now, some of it will be testamentary. A lot of it will be testamentary. They'll do this through their will. They'll do it through an IRA beneficiary designation. But some of it may be realized now because your donors may want to act on that desire to see some of this fulfilled during their lifetime. But those conversations don't take place in a transactional way. I want to just pause on that and see if we've got Bruce. I know you came on. The floor is yours, sir.
So I have a question. So we have a lot of people who have kids in middle school or high school, pre-college. How do you have a conversation about legacy giving when they haven't even paid for college yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think those kinds of conversations are slightly different because you're not talking about something that's realized. It's more, these will be testamentary gifts with them. And that's to separate is to make clear for them that there are very easy ways for little or no cost to create a legacy gift during their lifetime. Because for a lot of younger donors, there are vehicles that may be achievable for them. A simple bequest and hopefully they have a will. That's the first place we want to start. So we have a moral obligation to make sure that those in our community have a simple will. But they can use their will or they can use an IRA beneficiary designation, which is the easiest way to do this. And one of the more popular ways to do it because it doesn't cost anything. It's 15 minutes. You call your benefits administrator. You get the piece of paper that allows you to designate a percentage of your IRA that can be changed at any time. And that's where the stewardship piece comes in. But those are lower cost opportunities for younger donors to create these kinds of legacy gifts. The important piece is really where do we start the conversation? Because most of our conversations aren't starting with, hey, I want to talk to you about a legacy gift. Most of our conversations are starting somewhere before that, building a base and really understanding the relational side of things. you can use the framework of life and legacy as an opportunity to say, hey, I'd love to sit down and I'd love to sit down and really understand more about your involvement in the community and philanthropy. If we have time, I'd love to share with you some information about a new initiative that we're pursuing in the community. But don't pressure yourself to have all these conversations done just in a single conversation. Because if we're thinking in our minds about that ask that we have to make at the end of the conversation, that's the only thing that we're thinking about. The first conversation should be curiosity. What do we want to learn from them? And the goal, I often say the goal of the first meeting is to get the permission to have another meeting. Now, I know it takes time. These are not one and done type conversations. There is a time commitment to, but it's worth it. It's worth it because if we take an intentional approach and we're thoughtful about getting to know our donors, they are far more likely to agree to continue these conversations than if we are trying to rush the process. And that's what we see, unfortunately, at times with some of our fundraising that takes place in communities. Other questions on this front? Yes, Ellen.
Well, just a comment. I think at Jewish Family Service, I would say we have followed two different paths. One, with the path that provided us success in our life and legacy numbers for the first for year one, which was go to our best friends first. Our best friends are our board members and our past board members and our founders, and we were able to have a presentation, which we fashioned on somebody's, either the Jewish Federations or the Beth Emeths, but we did a PowerPoint presentation, and then we, in various ways, followed up with each board member and a number of the previous board members. And from that, I mean, the vast majority of these folks submitted LOIs. So that was very easy and successful. And we're doing a different sort of approach with our other major supporters. And that is really to spend time with them. As you're saying, Dirk, we're actually not, I mean, there's a few of them where we felt it was appropriate to bring up life and legacy in our first meeting, but we didn't try to get an answer on it. And with many of these people, it's the first time maybe ever that we have sat down with them and had that conversation with curiosity. So, I guess that's what year 2 and 3 in life and legacy are about, is taking the next step on those conversations.
Yeah, and hopefully what will happen is that the conversation in the community will be less and less around year 1, year 2, year 3, and it'll be more around, this is how we do fundraising in Ann Arbor. This is the approach that we take as a matter of course. This is our default. We start with a relational approach with our donors, and we build out the different pieces from there. And the one thing about the low-hanging fruit, board leadership is really critical here, and making sure that there's high levels of participation among your board members. And one thing to be mindful of is that take the same approach with your board members. Sometimes I've seen boards rush the process of, we want 100% participation. We've got copies of the Declaration of Intent here. We'd love for everybody to sign because we've got a quarterly goal deadline coming up. Our board members are our donors, and our board members aren't going to be board members forever unless boards don't have term limits. There are term limits, and so they'll cycle up. The engagement of our board members should be the same as the engagement of others, because it does two things. One, it creates the same sort of connections for them as an individual. And two, it's a safe space for us to practice having these conversations, especially if our board members are being engaged by their peers, because all of us need to hone our practice of what questions do I ask and what sequence will these come at? Well, am I too much in my head? What seems to be resonating? And when you're doing that with your board and taking the same approach, it's great practice as well. Eileen, I know you had a comment.
Yes, so Dirk, you work with communities and federations, across the country. And in some communities, there is a very robust both campaign and plan giving departments. Sometimes it's a total, you know, FRD department, but they're very robust. And so the work that you're describing, it's like, we know this is essential, and we know it has to be done. And we also know that it's time consuming and that we don't always have. So for example, I'll just take Federation. You know, the annual campaign is so essential, not just for our, you know, to measure our success, but for the community and our partners. And we have a great cadre of campaign volunteers who do work with donors. Some will meet with donors face to face, not all. And, you know, because you're working, you know, we don't have the professionalism, if you will, of the field that maybe a larger organization does. And we have a smaller cadre of folks, even with our life and legacy team, to have these meaningful, like, this stuff all takes time, I think is my point. And I'm just curious if you have examples of successful models for smaller communities like ours to be able to incorporate this kind of work into what they do in a meaningful, how they're managing it.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think when you have limited resources, when you have smaller communities that may not have all the professionalization as others, it's really critical, even more so, that these conversations become integrated with donor engagement just by default. I mean, when we think about planning for our work, oftentimes we think about, we're planning for the annual campaign. Here are the asks we're going to make in the annual campaign. Adding a layer of, here are the conversations we want to have with our donors, regardless of what that outcome might be. And the outcomes may be multiple, it may be singular. But instead of treating it as another or a side project, because the problem that happens is that often is that the annual campaign takes up so much of the oxygen in the room. And it's not just federations. Annual fund, whether it's a federation or an organization, takes time and takes resources. And if we're not planning to do more than just ask for an annual gift, it's not going to happen. The other piece that I would submit is it's really important for organizations to look at fundraising activities and be honest about what's working and what's not. Where are we spending most of our time? I know the federation world's better, but I also have seen this in JCC synagogues, is that it's not unusual for organizations to spend 80% of their time raising 20% of the money. Now, that was during a day when we were having events and we were doing all sorts of things to gather to raise additional resources. But how are we actually using our time? What's the allocation of human capital, actual capital in support of fundraising? And how much of that is being allocated to our significant relationships versus how much of that is being allocated to having events or doing text to give or whatever that happens to be, all of which has some level of validity. It's just the priority placed on that activity. So that's a really critical piece. And it's going to require more of volunteers. Your volunteers in Ann Arbor are going to have a heavier lift than they might have someplace else. And so I think it's really critical that when we're asking our volunteers to do this work, that one, we're reasonable about expectations in terms of the number of people we're asking them to talk to. Two, we give them opportunities to build their practice, opportunities to think through the questions they may want to ask of the person sitting across the table from them. And that could be peer-to-peer at the board level, it could be with a professional team member, but how are we actually training and empowering our leadership to be successful in those conversations? And the third is to set expectations around outcomes. It may be that your volunteers are the ones having those first conversations. They're having the relational conversations to get to know the person sitting across the table from them. And then there is some level of a handoff. And again, you'll have to figure out what that looks like, but not all of your volunteers may be comfortable with ultimately asking for someone to consider a legacy gift, but they may be comfortable in starting the relational piece of the conversation. Unfortunately, there aren't any shortcuts, but I would say that the biggest thing here is what else is getting in the way? What else is taking up our time? from a volunteer standpoint, from a professional standpoint, it's getting in the way of us doing the direct engagement work. It's so critical to make this successful beyond the parameters of life and legacy. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to just see if there were any other burning questions. Like I said at the very beginning, I would be thrilled to work with you going forward. If any of you have questions you want to bring up offline, my contact information is in chat. And I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you for the work that you do. I'm a firm believer that whether you're in Denver, Colorado, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, or somewhere else in the world, we're all creating ripples for the future of the Jewish life. So thank you. Other questions? Eileen, anything else to add before we say goodnight?
No, I just really want to thank everybody for engaging in this conversation, for you, Dirk, helping us to think. I mean, Life and Legacy is a great program, and as we've taught, and I think I forget what group I was speaking with yesterday, but I did talk about, that Life and Legacy is that kickstart in terms of, and then how do we incorporate this into the culture of our community long after, right? It's not just about these goals, but I think what you've really given us a lot of food for thought is how we incorporate and prioritize. I think that's really the key piece, how we make that space, how we prioritize legacy giving, endowment, planned giving, how we raise the profile of those people who make those gifts so that others are more aware of the impact they make on the community, how we help our board see the impact of these gifts and how important they are to our bottom line. So all of these lessons, I think, were helpful for me to hear, and I hope for other people. I think they really reinforce a lot of what we have been learning through Life and Legacy and what we all know to be important, but help us think a bit more about how we can really make it part of our lives. So I'm really grateful to you, Dirk, and grateful to all of you for being here. And we will make this recording that everybody helped me remember to do available along with, I'd love that article about the moral imperative, and we'll make other things available to folks. So I don't know if anybody has anything else they want to say, but thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone. It's great seeing you.
Thanks so much.
Eileen, we'll talk soon.
Absolutely.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Thank you.
Bye.